We're just warming up, but we have to move on to the off season that the Tigers have had and are having or will have once we get past the lockout. It was a busy November. Then everything shut down for December. I'm hearing a lot of people optimistic that the new CBA will get done, if not in time for spring training, then in time for opening day. So maybe our co-hosts and experts have thoughts on that. But first of all, where have the Tigers been and where are they going? And for that, we turn it over to Tigers Radio Pod stars and gurus and extraordinaires, Rogelio and Chris. Gentlemen, tell us how the Tigers are looking, what's been going on, and what should we look for next?
Well, I mean, you look at their offseason spending with Javier Baez and Raul Rodriguez, and they addressed two things they needed. First and foremost, a lefty starter, too, because you kind of had the sense that Matthew Boyd was going to be coming back based off his arm injuries. And Chris and I have talked about this before, the back and forth with how he was going to pitch. And he pitched better this year. He always has a good, strong beginning and then kind of fade in this as summer went on. But I know a lot of fans were kind of scratching their head about Baez and what about Correa and what have you. But if you look at both deals, it still gives them that two-year deal that can opt out. At the same time, Miguel Cabrera's contract ends, and it gives the Tigers flexibility. Chris, I mean, you and I have talked about this in terms of Baez as a defensive upgrade. His numbers, defensive run saved in 2019 were 31. The Tigers as a combined as a team was minus 15. And I know there's a lot of fans kind of upset about the fact that he does strike out. His OPS is not really good. But Chris, you did a really good article about combining 4 Tigers with Baez.
Yeah, well, it's going to be fascinating to see how fans react to Javier Baez, because he is one of the more exciting players when he's making contact and on the bases, and he's got a lot of range and a strong arm, but he also strikes out at a pretty precipitous rate, and he also, I believe, led the league in throwing errors because he gets to a lot of balls and thinks he can make every play. So I do feel like there's going to be a little bit of a love-hate relationship there, vaguely reminiscent of the Brandon Inge days, maybe, but. Yeah, no, it's. I think Tigers fans have every right to be excited about this offseason. The Tigers have spent, I believe, the 3rd most money in free agency. That's after right. Texas's outrageous, I think, $500 million spending spree, and then Toronto, I think, is up above 200,000 or 200 million as well. And there's never any awards for like having smart signings or winning, the analytic awards. But if you compare the projections for Eduardo Rodriguez with Robbie Ray and Kevin Gausman, Zips, I believe, considers them to be, projects them to be equals next year. And Rodriguez got 40 million less than those other two guys. So in that case, you can kind of give the Tigers credit for striking early and getting out ahead of the market. They've tried that a few times in the past with guys, and it ended up looking kind of bad. Like the one year, what was it? They took Jordy Mercer and Josh Harrison. They spent, $7-8 million on those guys, and better players were signing later for half of that. So I don't know. I think the Tigers have done well.
Yeah, I mean, even getting out ahead of time with the Tucker Bernhardt trade for a guy like Nick Quintana, who was struggling the second round. We saw him at West Michigan. I saw him down in Lakeland this year. Quintana was going to be it was just a really good opportunity for him, perhaps get another fresh start somewhere else. But Tucker Bernhardt is a really good defensive catcher upgrade. With Jake Rogers having Tommy John surgery, who knows when he's gonna come back. And you have Eric Costown, who's really, to me at least, he's a good role player, a good bench player to have. But to have him full-time catch next year, I mean, his defensive metrics too were actually better than what people anticipated. But at the same time, I really like the Bernhardt trade. They took advantage of the Reds team, who was just like, hey, we're going to sell everybody. And who knows what's going to happen to that rotation, for the Reds rotation. But that was one of my favorite moves, to just be out there that aggressive and get things going. And the Tigers definitely wanted to set a tone. And you can kind of tell, really, too, this is not just the signings just have a different tone to them a little bit. I mean, everybody gets on the Tigers about the Jordan Zimmerman signing, and I think that's, to me, was rather ridiculous. He was the second best free agent pitcher on the market at that time. Now, as Chris pointed out, the metrics show that he's showing a little bit of decline. But again, that was, who knew,
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of risk whenever you sign a free agent, particularly with injuries. It could just, they could fall apart at any time. So you worry about that a little bit. But yeah, you made a good point with Barnhart. The Tigers, we touched on this a lot. They were a 77 win team last year. They kind of were overperforming based on everything else. If you just went by WAR, they should have won somewhere between 68 and 74 games. So they were, and you can credit that to the coaching staff or just luck or however you want to do it. But they came into the year with a lot of areas where they can upgrade, but 3 very clear needs. And as you mentioned, once Jake Rogers went down, they didn't really have another catcher. So they went out and they traded for a guy who's got 2 Gold Gloves. And there's the old adage, you build up the middle. So they went out and they got a Gold Glove catcher. They went out and got a Gold Glove middle infielder, and they got a starting pitcher. And so they've addressed 3 really big needs with 3 solid additions. I do think there's still a little bit more work to be done if they want to contend for the playoffs next year. But we also talked about, and I wrote an article about this, much of this rebuild was always going to come down to the guys they drafted and developed. And we've seen the young pitchers already, but the big, the final next step is going to have to come from the young hitters, Spencer Torkelson, Riley Green, and to a certain extent, maybe Ryan Kreidler or somebody else. He at this point, he kind of becomes a depth piece, but you need those guys to succeed. And that's what's going to take you over the hump.
And I think you're speaking about the farm system. One of the things that I think should be addressed too is that when you look at the top prospects in the system right now, there's a deep drop off when Green and Torkelson come up, and even to a certain extent Ryan Kreidler, there's a steep decline, and that's kind of worrisome in a sense because a lot of the players they have right now in their system, for example, you have like Cody Clemens was added to the 40-man, which I thought was a good idea. He's a left-handed bat. They played him in the outfield last year in Toledo. I think it was right field, I believe, and that gives him that versatility. But Kreidler, again, made some really good. I mean, he came up to a lot of fans. He came up out of nowhere. This is a guy who struggled at Connecticut, took the straight shortened season, and there was a great article. I think it was actually, you know what?
It was David.
David from Fangraphs did a really good job of talking about his hitting and what he did to get better, and he really highlighted what Kreidler did. And there's power there. Chris has talked about how tall he used to play short a little bit, but I still think he has versatility to play third. And that's a guy you want to keep around because they could possibly use, for example, maybe Candelario or somebody else to trade to get an additional starter, because I think the Tigers still need another pitcher. I still think they need an outfielder because you can look at the outfield. Well, they have Akil Baldu. They have all these they have a really set outfielder now, Grossman, but Grossman's not getting any younger. Victor Reyes is still, to me, at least a good 4th outfielder. I think he's good, but I think he's a guy that you can't be sure if you're going to start him all the time. So I think they need another bat. But getting back to the minor leagues, there's still a steep drop off after Kreidler, and you have Dylan Dingler, but again, I just can't think of anybody else right now that stands out. You can talk about the young kids, you can talk about Campos, but they haven't been. They're still in rookie ball. There's nobody in low A or high A right now. Bo Brisky's a good idea too, but again, I need to see a little bit more. Colt Keefe's the name to look out for. Chris, was there any other names that we can kind of give them maybe like sleepers at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think the Tigers like Gage Workman. He's, a switch hitting, playing shortstop, probably another guy who's going to move to third base eventually. He's got some power. There's some swing and miss issues there, but they've improved their depth over the last few years. But a lot of that depth is not necessarily major league level. I mean, they could be, come up cup of coffee type guys, but it's not. Yeah, the impact I think is largely already arrived, or those handful of hitters we mentioned. And I don't know, David, is there anything you wanted to mention about the Kreidler piece? You wrote it. I would like to. No. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about how Baez strikes out a lot. I mean, that's the concern with Kreidler, right? His K number is he changed his swing, and he's striking out now. He's not a contact guy, so if he can merge those two things, contact and power, he's a productive big leaguer. But if he strikes out as much as he did this year, maybe not.
Well, and so one of the things we started publishing pieces over at Motor City Bengals about, it's kind of something we used to do over at Tigstown, where you look at all the minor league system and rank the players by their tools. And one thing that stood out about Kreidler, and baseball's funny. The stats might not mean anything, but his strikeout and walk rates improved every month. So in May, the first month of the season, he was striking out 33% of the time and walking 6%. And by September and October, it was like a 25% K rate and I think a 16% walk rate. So you don't know if, it's after a year off of pitching, maybe the pitchers are just dead tired and they can't throw strikes anymore, or maybe he's improving. But there were some good signs there, but I agree. And it's a strikeout issue. But you see that with a lot of hitters. And just from anecdotally, Rogelio and I watched an awful lot of minor league games this year. And it would seem that at times Kreidler was kind of befuddled by breaking balls in the zone. He just wouldn't pick up on them. And I don't know if, again, that's just anecdotal, but maybe that's something to watch going forward.
And also, you look at it this way too, with AAA, there's different ball, the stickier ball was used towards the tail end of the season. There's a different ball altogether used. So I think that the adjustment from Erie to Toledo could have been a factor, because you saw Riley Green getting jammed high inside fastballs. He couldn't get them, and then finally started making adjustments. And then we saw Spencer Torkelson, when she started going to the right, was a good adjustment. He was trying to figure things out, how to drive the ball the other way, so he wasn't so predictable. Those are the kind of things that I like. And the other thing about the farm system real quick that I want to mention is the pitching in terms of like Chavez Fernander and Garrett Hill and Bo Brisky. These guys were all drafted 25th round and beyond. And I know we have a lot of historians in the room here, but I can't remember a time the Tigers, okay, you can go and say, oh, well, Scott Eldred, but no one's going to know who the hell Scott Eldred is now. He was the first Tiger. He was drafted in the 9th or 10th round until Eric Skubal came along. He was the last Tigers lefty that was drafted in the 5th round or below to make his major league debut. So anybody who's smiling about a local reference, we did another one there. Scott Eldred, congratulations from, I believe he was from somewhere in the mid state. I can't remember. Anyway, but you see those type of pitchers, you see the kind of development that was, to me, stood out more than anything else. We haven't seen a lot of outside of the top round pitchers develop that way. And I think that's encouraging, because Chavez Fernander was a 32 round draft pick. He was pitching in Arizona Fall League. He has a good fastball. He was sequencing well, but again, what they going to do with him after that? It was nice to see another bullpen arm that wasn't some international signing that comes up, like the Gregory Sotos, and they've done well, but they need to do better as far as positional players on the international side.
Well, and if I just make one more point about the offseason, a lot of, we've talked about the farm system. It became clear, I think, to the organization that the farm system was not up to snuff, even though it's been this rebuild kind of built on prospects. We saw, what was it, in early August, or was it late August, where they basically broomed out their entire player developmental staff. Dave Littlefield was gone, David Chad was moved on, and they don't fire people, they just get reassigned. But it's kind of like the dude in Office Space who gets sent to the basement with a stapler. And they brought in Ryan Garko as a new head of player development, and we've seen, I don't know, half dozen other hires of these guys. Most of them have relationships to the Dodgers, which, as we talk about, the Dodgers are a player development machine. That's the best of the best. So, it remains to be seen if those guys will succeed here, but it's clearly something else that could, down the road, that could end up being the most important move of the offseason. We don't know, but it's kind of under the radar for now.
Yeah, and there's even the international, in terms of, you talk about the Rojas signing, is director of Latin player development. This is a guy who has pitching coaching experience. He did well in Boston. He was a bench coach in Pittsburgh. So he comes with a wealth of knowledge, connections, and he's the all-time, fun fact, he's also the all-time leader in saves for the Cuban national team. So there's your bloop stat for the day. So, but Nathan, you wanted to ask us a question?
Yeah, so a question about the big signing is Baez, and the big player they didn't get was Correa. I want to ask you about that. One thing about Baez, I saw a couple people say, if Baez only got some plate discipline, he'd be an MVP. I'm thinking Baez goes for broke. That's what makes him Baez. It's like me saying, if my car grew wings and flew, it'd be a great car. It ain't gonna happen. Maybe you think that it's possible that the Tigers can change its approach. I don't know. I'm curious about that. But the larger question is about Correa, because as so many fans, at least the ones I and probably you follow on Twitter, thought it was Correa or bust. We had one thing on our Christmas list. We're going to get Correa. And not only do we want Correa, but this is going to be the litmus test about whether Chris Ilitch is going to spend money to any extent, not as much as his father did, but to some extent. And so when the Tigers backed off Correa, that got us worried. Now, you can make the case. I mean, for $140 million and not having to commit 10 years like they would to Correa, that's a pretty good bargain. I'm not interested in Chris Ilitch getting bargains, but that you see the logic there, especially if they can spend some of that other money on another starting pitcher. So how disappointed should we be? How disappointed are you about not getting Correa? And is Baez a consolation prize, or is he something more?
Personally, I'm not disappointed. I mean, I think that something that was interesting that seemed to drop as the lockout was happening, it kind of seemed like a PR thing by MLB baseball, was simply, oh, by the way, he's got lingering back issues. And those kind of things was like, well, what? It just seemed, and I always make the comparison to Larry Bird. Larry Bird, towards the tail end of his career, had a bad back. You always saw him on the side of the court just always laying down. And then there was that story on the Sports Century where he had an inverter, he took a shotgun after his playing career and blew it up. And back injuries always are linger. They never go away. And if he was talking about, he wanted to get paid more than Francisco Lindor. So if it's in the neighborhood of $400 million rather, I don't know. That doesn't make the Tigers flexible. And if you look at the rest of the division right now, Minnesota's been quiet, but they're going to spend at some point. Cleveland, Cleveland hasn't really done much or will do much, I think, because just based off their patterns in the offseason, they'll sign one or two players, and then they brought up, I think, what was it, Chris, like 5 or 6 players for the 40-man roster for the minor leagues. They had like a high amount. So they're going to look within. Kansas City is going to always find somebody that they are familiar with. With Moore there in Kansas City, he's always going to find somebody that he has some rapport or had one in the past. And Chicago, they're kind of, I think they're not going to spend any more either. So I just think that the Tigers right now are in a good opportunity with Baez. Again, defensively is a big upgrade. Is a huge upgrade. And he is going to be motivated for those 2 years to potentially opt out. And the Tigers still they can see at that point whether Kryler is going to be something, whether Colt Keefe is going to be something that could potentially go on the left side of the infield.
I'm always been fascinated by kind of what amounts to fan groupthink. There's kind of this groundswell where everybody agrees that you have to do one thing, and we had some fun with it with the Motor City Bengals Twitter account. Right before the season, we asked Tigers fans at that point it was 4 shortstops did you want. It was Trevor Story, Carlos Correa, Corey Seager, Javier Baez. Baez came in last, but Story was number 1 and Seager was number 2, and then Correa was number 3. And then fast forward 7 months, we did the exact same thing, and it was Correa like 80%. So it was 1 year changed all these fans' minds, and I don't think as a team you can't necessarily rely on that. Now I do think Correa is probably the best overall of all those shortstops. But there's some, he's not a perfect player. This isn't you're going out getting Mookie Betts or whatever. This is a guy who he's an excellent defender. He's also not, athletically speaking, he's not an athlete that Javier Baez is. Javier Baez is an above average runner. He's got a strong arm, but there's a chance that Correa may have to move to third base before Baez does because he might be not move as well. But it's also, with every free agent, it's a two-way street. And Tigers fans wanted Correa, and I think the Tigers did too. We saw that leaked footage leaked video of, I guess, leaked
infamous
pictures
breakfast.
Of AJ Hinch having breakfast /lunch with Carlos Correa. We also know that AJ Hinch met with Carlos Correa's agent back at the owner meetings or the GM meetings or whatever it was. That wasn't widely reported, but we heard about it. And I believe Cody Stevenhagen of The Athletic, I don't know if he outright said it, but he was basically insinuating that the Tigers made an offer in the range of like $270 million, like $30 million a year for Correa. And maybe Correa, we've heard people, who's it, Kevin Goldstein, who used to be an executive with the Astros and presumably knows Correa fairly well, thinks that Correa wants to be in a big market where he can be a superstar. And, Detroit's a fun kind of up and coming team, but it's hard to be a superstar in Detroit unless you know, you kind of are homegrown.
Not to
Yeah,
mention
can
too.
can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, why is everybody assuming that Correa will not still sign with the Tigers? It's not like, Baez was taken in the draft and somebody else took Correa. When you look at what Texas did, I think there's a non-zero chance that the Tigers could end up getting Correa, possibly on a shorter term deal with an opt-out where he can prove that he is healthy, that his back is fine. I think I think it's realistic.
It really, no, and you bring up a good point, David, that I didn't consider. It just really depends what they're going to do with the likes of Candelario, who is I think he's eligible for arbitration. So I know that's not much of a raise compared to Correa, but I mean, even for example, I know he did an interview in Spanish where he talked about, like, he was preluding to the fact that, oh, I like the team in stripes and making the jokes about that and what have you. And then you, of course, think of the Yankees. But there's one team that I know they spent a lot of money already, but they've been also kind of rather quiet. It's an old friend of ours, David Browski, over in Philly. They need a shortstop really bad. And I think that is a team that would be considering that him. I know the Yankees send out so many mixed signals. I'm not really sure what the situation is over there, but I think Correa, if he did sign here, you move him to third, and then you move Candelario for a starter, which they definitely need another starter in the rotation. But because the Tigers, if you look at it in terms of infield depth right now, outside of Scope and Cabrera, Clemens will see some time maybe at second base, but if he struggles offensively, it just seems like there's almost like a void there. And Clemens is not really good defensively by the metrics at second base, right, Chris? From my recollection.
Yeah, I mean, the scouting reports have him as kind of a fringe average defender basically everywhere.
Yeah, and so no, if they can sign Correa, like, almost do what Texas did, which was, again, one of those most insane 48 hours I've ever seen in my life in terms of free agency, that would be great. But I don't know. As a fan, just pure using we as a fan, yes, that would be great to see a stacked lineup like that. But as a writer and podcaster and viewing the game from a neutral point of view, I just think it would hold back the Tigers. It depends on the length of the deal, but if they get them something big, I don't know. I just think that might hinder some of the development of Kreidler or what have you. But if Kreidler is who he is, then it won't matter. But
right, and Baez can also play second base. Baez has played second.
Yeah, that's where he won his Gold Glove.
Yeah.
Could I say that?
No, he wanted shortstop. Yeah, go ahead.
In response to David's question, which is a good one, to me, here is where the difference between Mike Ilitch and Chris Ilitch comes into play. If it's Mike Ilitch, you can see him going for broke and say, okay, Baez at second, Correa at short. Now, Chris Ilitch, people say, well, he's cheaper than his father. He doesn't want to spend money on the team. I don't think we know, because nobody's going to spend big bucks except Texas when there's no plan to return to contention in the last 5 years. So now we can start to evaluate Chris Ilitch. But again, with Chris instead of Mike, it seemed as though from the beat writers, all the internal messaging was, well, we had the hole at short, we filled the hole at short, we saved some money in doing that. Now we'll spend that money elsewhere. That seems to be the logic under the finances of current ownership. I don't know. I don't have any inside info, but that seems to be it, that it was either Correa or Baez in the equation.
Yeah, well, when Baez did his introductory press conference, Chris Ilitch was, of course, on the call. And Ilitch was asked, either it may have been Cody Stavenhagen, it may have been Evan Petzold, asked him, what is next after this signing? And I'm sure you saw the quotes. Chris Ilitch said, well, that's the question, for Al. So to me, that can be interpreted as, I am willing to spend if Al sees a move that we should make.
Yeah, and Nathan, you made a point that I was going to make was for a couple of years now, ever since Mike Ilitch died, people were questioning whether his son was going to spend money at all, because he didn't really. I mean, the Tigers spent a little bit every offseason, enough to not get a grievance filed against them by the Players Association, but nothing big. And so everybody was kind of like, I don't know, is he going to spend it all? And this offseason says, yeah, okay, he's willing to $220 million or whatever. What we don't know yet is if he has that kind of late Mike Ilitch, whatever, let's do it. Sign Prince Fielder, sign Justin Upton at the end of the of offseason. And we've talked, and just the way this offseason is playing out, there was this feeding frenzy right before the lockout. Deadlines work for that sort of thing. And of course, this is neither here nor there, but the owner said, "Look at all this money we spent. The game's fine," which is like saying hey, the economy's humming along great because Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are making $350 million. What are you worried about? So we don't know when the CBA gets agreed upon, how much time there's going to be for signings and things like that. I feel like a lot of that is what the owners want. They want another, truncated signing period there after the lockout ends so they can get guys at a discount. And the one thing we don't know is if Chris Ilitch is willing to say, let's say Carlos Rodon, who was an excellent pitcher last year, but has serious arm risk concerns, say he's still out there, would they go, you know what? Okay, we'll give you a 1-year deal for 25 million, which I would consider a splash. And that could be the sort of thing that would propel them to the playoffs, or it could be a completely empty $20 million. But I could see something like that coming later. And to David's point, maybe something like that with Carlos Correa. If he doesn't find the long-term deal he wants, maybe he'll take a 1-year, 25, 30, $35 million deal and go back and be a free agent again next year when he's 28, which is still a very normal age. So we could see all that play out. I'm a little bit skeptical they're going to make another huge splash like that. I think they're going to kind of piecemeal it together, maybe a bullpen arm or another back end starter. But it is one thing that's kind of been lingering in the back of my mind if they might just go big again.
Yeah, because even look at the arms in the market right now too. It's kind of a drop off.
Yeah.
In terms of maybe 2 years ago I've been excited about Carlos Martinez, but he's been struggling for St. Louis, and some of his numbers have indicate that. Mike Fiers, he's 36 years old. Okay. But I mean, other than that, Tyler Anderson's an arm that I'm intrigued by because he does have some of the deeper numbers look like he'd be a good fit for the back end of rotation. And somebody last night on our Discord channel mentioned Michael Bidea from Minnesota, and he's a workhorse. And, he's built like a horse too. But I think he'd be a good end too as well.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to interject if I could and hear if
Sure.
Roger and Chris have an opinion. Mike Ilitch was a risk taker. He started Little Caesars. That's a different personality. Chris has to be a maintainer, because if Mike blows it all, he could say, well, I built this franchise and I built this company and I went out in flames, but look what I did. Chris has got the pressure that he can't goof up daddy's stuff. I see him in a completely different realm as compared to his dad. He's looking at a legacy, and if he's going to live 40 more years, he doesn't want a sucky team. I think they're going to do some of these mid-level signings, is my opinion. I love what Avila has done over the time. Everything is not 100%. But I noticed, and I don't know where I read it, and I could have heard it on the podcast, but the last draft the Tigers had was athlete-driven, fast-twitch muscle people. And I'm a track coach. But they drafted a son of one of my former athletes. And I knew his mom and dad in middle school and high school, and these people exuded athletic ability. They were Division I athletes. So when I'm looking at this, if I'm Chris Ilitch, I want a Royals and a Cardinals where we're putting out athletes a long time. But dad was a whole different beast. He built the Red Wings and the Tigers. So I'm more positive. And the Baez signing is great because if Kreidler or Workman do work, you only have your new signing for 2 years. You can force him to third, trade him. Dombrowski will still be at Philadelphia, which I think is a great insight, Roger. I didn't even think of that. So I'm liking what they're doing, but it was hard to live through. But Ilitch can't be the guy that blows dad's pizza company and franchise. So he's going to be in a totally different realm. And I also heard that the woman, I think she's from Australia, who's like this analytics person in Florida, is going to be moved to Detroit, and she's got all this more money. And I guess she's like this diamond in the rough that has really bought on people. And that's probably why they jettisoned Chad and Littlefield and the 12 minor league coaches. Like, we're doing it this. If you don't buy in, you're gone. I know I said a lot, but I think these are things personality wise we have to look at when we're constructing the team.
Oh, I completely agree with you, Mitch. I mean, Chris, do you remember her name? I can't remember her name right now at the moment, but
it's her last name's Philbin, I believe, and it's Georgia or Georgina. I feel bad, but yeah, she's kind of the head of the sports science department there, and they are very enthused about her. And no, I think Mitch's point is good that Mike Ilitch was very much in his latter years, at least, driven by stars. He loved to go after the stars and bring them in. And Chris Ilitch, and it's something that they've talked about, they use the word sustainability. It's what every farm system aims to be. If you want to be the Dodgers or the Rays, where you just have this never-ending parade of average to above average to great players coming up through your system, and it gives you so much flexibility. And that's what everybody wants. It remains to be seen if they can do that. But yeah, so I don't know. I think they've done a pretty solid job so far, but that's the stuff that's going to take a few years to figure out.
Well, Dylan Rosa, what we saw was the example of what Mitch was talking about, fast twitch, and he showed great improvement last year. Eric De La Rosa, we got a chance to talk to him in West Michigan, really worked. He was trying to find his identity as a player, and he talked about that extensively. And his numbers last year, and I know he was on some sleeper in terms of farm sleepers. I think Baseball America had him in there too. He is an example of what you're talking about, Mitch, and that kind of he's athletic, he can run. He doesn't have some power, but he was hitting when I saw him down in Lakeland, he was hitting the left, he was hitting the right, great speed in the outfield. And that's good to see for something, again, a later round draft pick, which the Tigers have struggled historically to even develop. And you look at guys like Dylan Smith and Ty Madden, for example. Jackson Jobe, I know a lot of fans were like, why Jackson Jobe? There's reasons the Tigers know that, obviously, that we don't know, that based off some of the peripherals and his age and in terms of, he's an athlete, though. His father was a tennis coach, or his father played tennis. But Smith and Madden remind me of draft picks that can come up sooner than later. That could perhaps, depends on what happens when they get to see him play. But honestly, that even Austin Murr is not much of an athlete, but he came in, quickly made an impression on me down in West Michigan. He had a 15-game hitting streak, and that was something that was like, it was something good to see. Even Mike Rothenberg, too, the catcher down, who they drafted from. Thank you, Chris, for putting that in there. The catcher out of Duke. There's a lot of things about this draft that I like that don't seem like the typical Tigers MO, because in the past you can go, well, if he's in the SEC and he's 6'6", bam, the Tigers are going to draft him. And, so, but anyways, that's just, yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, there you go. But Chris, did you want to add anything else before we move on?
No, I don't. I think we've covered, we covered the signings. We covered where else they can go in the future. I think Tigers fans should be excited. I also think, I touched on it earlier, that they kind of overperformed last year. And we've discussed this, where I could see it being entirely possible this year that they win 77 games again, even though they're a better team. They could even win fewer games depending on injuries. You never know. But it's baseball teams aren't always on a linear path up to contention. It's not like the 1980s Pistons or whatever, where you take a step and then finally you're there. It's sometimes teams succeed a year or two before you think they will. I think the Astros did that. Basically, before they were really championship contenders, they kind of just played their way into the playoffs one year, and then it was another year before they were actually contending. And the Twins of recent vintage, I think, under the guidance of Hall of Famer Paul Molitor, had one great year, and people were projecting great things, and then they were the worst team in baseball the next year. So I think Tigers should be kind of cautiously optimistic. Tigers fans should. But I think it's probably still, if they don't make any more moves, we're still talking about a team that's going to win somewhere between like 74 and 84 games.
Yeah, and I'll take that. We look at an example of Akil Baddoo comes to mind. His first half of the season, he put up a slash line 271, 351, and 462. He had less home runs than he did in the second half of the season, but his batting average dropped. So I think he was still figuring out how to hit left-handers and those things that he might regress a little bit. And when I hear fans, and we've said this we've had in comments and articles, well, do they have enough outfielders? No, they don't. And Riley Green's not for sure. Riley Green, for his age, is special, is absolutely special. But how long before he'll make an impact? I think the Tigers still have to address getting an outfielder. I really believe that. In addition, the bullpen help another lefty that can complement Soto, that maybe is more of a ground ball pitcher compared to, speaking now that the Tigers have defense, than Soto, who throws 100 miles an hour and can strike out everybody, but still has a walking problem. And so if we're being realistic, the Tigers, again, and I mentioned this earlier, get an outfielder that can go give you some power and because across the outfield, let's be real here. It was nice to see Grossman's 2020 season, 20 home runs, 20 steals, 20 doubles, but he's another year older. And if you even look at somebody like who could play left defensively, defensive metrics, they're one of the worst teams in the outfield last year. And that's not often talked about because they got 77 wins. And I know Tiger fans should be excited, but I think for some people out there who I thought they took a big step up last year. No question about it. But they still have work to do. These two signings don't mean they're going to make the postseason. And the AL Central, yes, it sets them up a little bit more. But you still have other teams you got to think about in the American League. You have Tampa to think about. You have this juggernaut transformer that Texas is building that's still going to put them in third place. But either way, I just think there's other factors to consider here. But definitely an outfielder would be, to me, the next big logical step.
Can I ask you, because the question I had was sort of big picture, what is the state of the roster? And to me, there's an argument to be made that for the first time in a long time, there are no huge holes. I mean, we went through a lot of years where the roster was mostly holes. And now, if Grossman and Bidea can equal their production, which are big ifs, if Green can make an immediate impact, which is an if, although all signs are that, he's just a stellar hitter. And if Torkelson arrives, so there's a lot of ifs, but it also feels like for the first time there are no major holes. Your point is well taken that a corner outfielder could definitely be high on the wish list. The rotation definitely needs a little more work. But is it fair for us to say that, okay, your caution is well taken, Chris? They're not going to waltz into the World Series next year. But that's just the feeling I have after watching a lot of these games from a lot of these very flawed rosters the last few years, that for the first time, top to bottom, I don't see a major liability yet in the field.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, heading into the season, I might have argued that they needed to upgrade at catcher, even though they had Eric Haas and Jake Rogers, just because they're, kind of both older players who had some success in limited time period, but you don't, baseball is such a game of adjustments. You don't know if somebody's going to be able to repeat that in the following year. So, but that was a huge hole that they addressed and Tucker Barnhart is not a world beater, but he's a quality, almost average hitter against right-handed pitching. And he's a lefty, so he's going to get the majority of the playing time there. And he's a very good defender. And then Eric Haas, as Rogelio mentioned earlier, he's probably best as more of a kind of utility part-time player, and he can face off against lefties who he absolutely destroys. So they've not only have they fixed holes, but they've kind of put together a couple situations where they've got solid platoons, which is a good way to maximize your roster. And AJ Hinch is great at that. That's one of his best skills. So I do think you're right. I think that the roster itself as a whole, you could argue that they might want to add a little bit more depth. Maybe Victor Reyes isn't an ideal fourth outfielder or fifth outfielder. Maybe they want a super utility guy like a Jonathan VR we talked about. But yeah, this is a team that should be able to go out there and compete every night and come close to a 500 record, if not better. And one thing we touched on our last show, I think our third host, Yoop, mentioned, we don't really know what the CBA is going to reveal. And we know the owners want an expanded playoffs. So if there are 7 playoff teams in each league or something like that we looked, the American League last year was kind of a gauntlet. There were 7 teams that won 90 games, but in the National League, I believe the Phillies would have been the 7th team with 83 wins. And so if there's 7 teams getting in, the Tigers could theoretically eke into a playoff appearance. So that would be, I think, really exciting for Tigers fans who haven't had a whole lot to cheer about over the last 5 years.
And
yeah, one thing.
Oh, go ahead.
One thing that is going to help any team in a given year is to have a player step up who underperformed the previous year. Does anybody stand out to any of you guys who the best candidate is in 2022?
That's a good question, David. And for me, I think if I in terms of just who they have right now, I think a guy like Daz Cameron. And the reason why I say that is in terms of what he still has a lot to prove. When he's healthy, he's good. In terms of he's solid, he was getting better. I think Daz Cameron is somebody that can maybe step up and prove his worth a little bit more. The genes are there, and I think the ability is there, but I think it's kind of a mental thing. And I remember when we talked to him a couple of years ago in Toledo, I think, well, maybe it was a manager thing or something, but he just seemed like he was in a different headspace. And Chris, you remember the vibe in that
Yeah, it was
it was strange, but
unpleasant.
But now with AJ Hinch there, I mean, you see that progression of, like, for example, Jake Rogers becoming a very effective catcher. And before, I felt like he was just tossed to the wind by the organization before him in terms of Ron Gardenhire and how they treated him. He didn't even get a chance to get called up in 2020 at all. And that didn't make any sense to me, because I thought he had the best arm in the system. I understood he had a couple pass ball issues, but it just seemed like there was still the potential there. What about you, Chris?
Well, so I will say that I wouldn't predict anybody's going to have like a big breakout year, but if there are two players who I think could very much affect the future of the team, and one is Matt Manning, who was one of the three big arms, and he was dominant all throughout the minors, was the Eastern League Pitcher of the Year in AA, and then it just didn't work for him in AAA and in the majors. I mean, we saw some flashes, but this was a guy who was kind of billed as a potential future ace, and he came up and he couldn't miss bats with his fastball, and he was messing around with multiple different breaking balls and just learning how to pitch on the fly in the big leagues. And as of right now, it's going to be like the fifth starter position. If there are no injuries, it's going to be between him and Tyler Alexander, who had a solid season, but is not, probably not more than a number 4, number 5 starter either. So if Matt Manning could take a step forward and refine his stuff and look more like a mid-rotation starter, I think that'd be a big break for the Tigers. And the other one is Derrick Hill. And Derrick Hill is an incredibly fast guy who looks like a great defender. He didn't grade out well in the metrics, but it was kind of a short amount of time, and he was hitting pretty well when he was up. Now he has this kind of reckless abandon center field mentality that we see with guys occasionally. I think of Grady Sizemore, and there are probably some great examples from the past of these guys who will just run full speed into a brick wall. And sometimes that kind of diminishes their career, but he's a guy who, if he puts it together and can hit a little bit, he's your number 9 hitter. He's out there playing what it seems like he should be able to play Gold Glove caliber center field. That could be a huge benefit for the Tigers. But like I said, I wouldn't predict either one of those to happen. I think but they could.
Yeah, when Hill worked on he's changed his swing mechanics to get more power, starting in, was it AA when he was in Erie, and then when he was progressing, he started showing more power, and that kind of helped him out a little bit. But if there's one thing that we're talking about the farm system real quick, there's one thing about this last couple seasons I've noticed that I've watched the Tigers since the late 80s, and this is the first time in my adult life that I've seen more than just 2 contributors. You look at the 06 team. Okay, so it's Verlander and Granderson. Okay, you have Omar Infante. Pardon me?
Zumaya.
Yes, Zumaya. But Zumaya kind of flamed out, but Verlander and Granderson's a different story. But this is the first time, in terms of a pitching rotation, you have 3 homegrown starters in your rotation. This is something we haven't seen since the great Bill LaJoie draft in the mid-'70s. You're seeing minor leaguers actually contribute, because you're not going to tell me that Felipe Lira or Kevin Ritz or Sean Bergman in the mid-'90s were going to do anything. And everybody talked them up a little bit. I remember reading the news, and Henning did do a fantastic job of talking these guys up, but there wasn't much there. Now we're getting regular contributions. We're talking about Derrick Hill. We're talking about Jake Rogers. And that's something that the one thing, if they could do, which was something that you guys mentioned, Lou Whitaker, to kind of close this out a little bit, get a infielder that's drafted within the system. Please. I mean, it would be fantastic. I mean, Infante and Santiago, okay, fine. But in terms of like one that's a regular all-star, I mean, the Tigers went from they went from Whitaker to easily to just a bunch of random people until Polanco, then Kinsler. Well, then it was the Scott Sizemore, Will Myers situation, and then you had Kinsler, and it's just been a carousel ever since. So I'd love to see that. If they can do that, in addition to homegrown pitching, that to what they're doing right now, that's fantastic. And the player development has to continue to develop these players that at least are serviceable. If they get serviceable out of that, like Derrick Hill, for example, he might not be an all-star, but he's a great watch. That catch in Toronto still stands out in my mind, him just sliding like that. That, to me, is a good indication of what your farm system can do.
Yeah, I have one final thought. The player that I was thinking of who disappointed this year is Willie Castro. It seems like everybody has forgotten about him or given up on him. He's 24 years old and he hit in the high minors. So, you know, has anybody seen that says that he won't do it in the big leagues?
Well, and I think he's a great example of what we were kind of talking about. There might be some regression this year, not necessarily obvious, but he was a guy who was great in a very short period in 2020 and struggled this year. And that happens. I mean, there's a term for it, the sophomore jinx, the sophomore curse, all that stuff. So we could see that with Bidea and Haas and Skubal and Mize and Manning. We could see that with all of them. But then there's the guys who do adjust afterward and figure things out. And Castro he's got surprising power. He's a good runner. He's pretty good at contact. You know, he swings at just about everything. And I was kind of one of the last holdouts that he could play shortstop, and I don't think that anymore. I think he's kind of been pushed at second base, but he could become that. I talked about Jonathan VR. They had Castro playing left field. He played second base. He played shortstop. He can play third. He could become, I know he was acquired in a trade, but kind of the homegrown super utility guy, maybe take over for the role that Nico Goodrum had last year. So that's a good one, David.
Yeah, David, and there's something I did catch a handful of at-bats down in the Dominican Winter League where he has played for pretty much since I think 2016, 2017. And Chris and I were trying to debate about this yesterday. I sent him a video of him earlier this year to the one at bat I found. It looks like his bat's got a little quieter. The swing mechanics still look the same, but again, I would have to see more of a sample size. And so maybe he's working on something down there, but he hasn't played since I think he has an injury, which is why he hasn't played. But nevertheless, he could be tinkering on something to try to quiet his swing a little bit to make it to where he can generate more power and hit the ball to all fields. But no, Willie Castro defensively, as long as he doesn't put a short, I think the Tigers are fine. But that's a guy they really can't. You're absolutely right. They can't give up on him. But I admittedly was frustrated by some of the plays last year. It seemed like more of a mental thing where he just it cost the Tigers a couple. I don't say cost them a couple games, but it did cost them a couple runs where the tide turned a little bit and the momentum switched to the other way. I don't believe in momentum, but I think it's either way. I just think that he changed how the game was going. But yeah, that's a good one to bring up. So if anybody else has any other questions before we get out of here, we really appreciate the time and thank you for allowing this opportunity, Nathan. And this was really a lot of fun.
Thanks to you guys. Really appreciate it. Let me ask by asking you your outlook for this lockout and this work stoppage. It seems to me that it's not just grousing. There are some real fundamental issues here that the players especially want to correct. The issue of service time, players getting underpaid for so long and then not getting the big windfall in free agency. The issue of tanking where teams just refuse to spend. I knocked Texas, but hey, at least they're spending money. So it seems like there's some big issues that are currently really working against the players. On the other hand, like I said, I've also seen some optimism that this will get resolved at least by opening day. What are your thoughts? Because the worst outcome for us would be to finally get a good Tigers roster, then they can't take the field. When will we see them?
I think it's going to get done. It's maybe that's just me I'm normally very pessimistic, so maybe I should lean into that. But for whatever reason, we've talked about this, and people have seen this strife coming for years, and we talked about it like in detail 2 years ago because it seemed like nothing was happening in the offseason. I feel like for all the seeming and discontent, I really don't feel like they're that far away on what they need to do. The players, it was like I was talking earlier, the players want more money for guys who haven't reached free agency, and they want the guys to get to free agency earlier. I think there's a way to do that without destroying the game and blowing everything up, and where the owners can still get money. And I would expect that in the CBA it'll be like a graduated thing, where it'll be probably a system similar to what we have right now for 2 years, and then somewhere in the middle, 2 years after that. And what they've discussed, and I think it'll end up happening is it'll be some form of what they do in hockey, I guess, the 7-year 27 thing. So, if you've been with a team for 7 years or you're 27 years old, then you become a free agent. And I think we could see something like that. It's just a matter of them honing in on the exact right increments. And what are the owners? The owners offered 28.5 or something like that, maybe 29, and the
It
players
was
will
a
probably
29. Yeah.
players will bring it down. I think they'll find something in the middle, and the players will. Unfortunately, everything in the game has to be a negotiation now. So, as much as both sides talk about like the quality of the game, it's like I mean, if you want a universal DH, that's another 15 jobs. So you got to give us something. And I think the players will eventually allow for the expanded playoffs. I don't know how much. I'm kind of not crazy about what did the owners want? They wanted 14 teams, 16 teams, something kind of wild. But I think the players will give that up if they can hammer out the service time stuff. And beyond that, I don't know what else they really need to figure out. I mean, there's talk about in an international draft, but as we've seen many, many times, the players will eventually just kind of sacrifice people who aren't in their union yet to get more for them. And I could see that happening again.
I like Jason Stark brought up from the Athletic brought up an interesting concept for a way for teams to stop from tanking without changing baseball, which was reverse the draft. That means the teams that missed the best record would pick first in draft, with the teams with the worst record getting lower picks. And that would kind of have teams wanting to win every season. And a lot of times we've seen this. A famous model comes to mind with the Houston Rockets to get Hakeem Olajuwon in basketball, for example. Those are kind of things where I like that. It seems like a really weird idea, but in a sense, I understand where it's coming from, because you have your Pittsburghs, the Colorados in the world that I think are just trying to keep, I'm not sure about Colorado rather, but I was saying like Pittsburgh and Cleveland that want to win, but they want to keep the cost low. It doesn't punish them, but it punishes a team like, let's say, an example would be what Houston did a few years back, something like that to that effect. So I don't know. It would take something like an interesting idea like that would keep the game the way it is, because I don't like this idea of tanking. I don't like it at all. I just think it's ridiculous. It's really bad for baseball because or artificial with the luxury tax that creates this artificial salary cap. There's a lot of things that need to change, but I think the biggest thing that I think this hopefully gets resolved, and I wrote an article about this the other day, is stop the damn black. I know there's some financial indications that are beyond my apprehension to understand, but we had a gentleman who was 63 years old who's a big disc golf fan out of all things. Chris, I showed Chris this comment yesterday. He said he stopped watching a game because Valley Sports is not available on his satellite provider. They don't make it easier. They're the marketing of the game and making the product easier to find. I mean, Uper, our third co-host, he can watch 6 teams in Iowa. And Iowa doesn't even have a major league team. So they have to address that too. They're losing the audience to the millennials and Gen Z. Those are things. So that's a separate thing. I understand that. But that is still part of growing the game. If you don't appeal to a younger audience, you're not going to see that. And we did have a question from Tony.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. Go ahead, Tony.
What do you think the outlook is for Scooble for next year, and for his future after that too?
Thank you for the question, Tony. Go ahead, Chris. I'll let you go on this one.
Yeah, so I'm one of those people who kind of view Scooble as having more upside than Casey Mize. Now, Casey Mize was arguably one of the more consistent pitchers in baseball this year. It wasn't consistently great, but he was consistently very good. And Scooble would have these flashes of absolute dominance. I recall he hit the Astros over 7 innings, I think, with 9 strikeouts. He had a spectacular outing against the Cardinals. But he also was very home run prone. And that's something you have to worry about in the future. And our buddy Brandon Day from Bless You Boys went through the entire Tigers pitching staff and looked at which pitchers seemingly were affected by the banning of the sticky stuff, as it were, the spin rate. And Scooble was the only one. His spin rate was down like 200 RPMs. And what you worry about there is kind of what made him such an interesting prospect. He was a guy who could just rear back and throw fastballs right over the top of bats. And that's probably because he was getting the extra RPMs from that sticky stuff, presumably. We don't really know any other ways to gain spin. So I'm a little bit worried about that. But you take a guy who's got a full year in the majors, and it was okay. It was solid. And you add a veteran like Eduardo Rodriguez to the staff. Hopefully that helps. I want Rodriguez to work with Skubal immediately on improving his changeup, because I think that would go a long way to helping him keep batters off the fastball. And a lot of it with Skubal is he's a very intense competitor. You see, like I think AJ Hinch said, like, dude, we're on the same team. Like, it's okay. But he's just very intense and into it. But there are times where I feel like that's a detriment to him. When you watch him pitch, he will almost just do a get me over fastball. And he seemed like he got hurt on a lot of those where he just wasn't. I don't know if he was used to just throwing it down the middle or was just trying to get ahead instead of locating on the corners, and he would give up a home run, and that can really short circuit an outing and a season. So I think he'll improve in that regard, but he's another one where I wouldn't be shocked if he's actually better by the metrics next year, but his ERA might be worse just because he was, I think his FIP this year was like a run higher than his ERA.
And there's one thing I want to add to it, because Chris did a really good job explaining it. Really, he's the fastest Tigers pitcher to 200 career strikeouts. That says something. That says something that it kind of reminds me in a way, and the only reason why I compare it because he's tall and lanky, just like Randy Johnson. Once Randy Johnson figured out command and realizing that he could beat hitters just by not only his fastball, he was one of the most feared pitchers out there, and he's in a Hall of Fame now. Am I comparing him to Johnson to a certain extent? If once Johnson figured it out, it made it easier for him. I think it's just a matter of time, and I think Skubal will improve next year. And I had him last year, admittedly, in the beginning of the season as a Rookie of the Year candidate, because his stuff going through the minors was stuff we haven't seen. I don't know, Chris. I've been following the team for a long time. I've never seen anybody that was just at that pace that he was. Comparatively speaking, when you look at some big prospect like Nate Cornejo, and everybody was talking about that, his strikeout Skubal numbers were insane. And I really think that the Rodriguez being on the team will help him too. And another offseason of working on his craft a little bit. He goes to drive line. He's looking at his numbers. He's looking at his progression. So I think we're going to see some progress next year in terms of, I think the home runs will go down, and I'd love to see an ERA under 3 would be nice, but beggars can't be choosers. But I think there'll be some good progression forward. And then there was a question in the chat. Will Mize's splitter be the weapon we thought he would? You see the back off it last season. That's a good question, Nathan. And Chris, I know that you and I've talked about is one of his best pitches, but I actually kind of like the fact that he was working the corners, and it seemed like he was, I don't want to say pitching to contact, but I think his approach last year was far different than what we saw in the minors.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, Casey Mize's best trait might be his ability to figure things out while he's out there on the mound. If he doesn't have a splitter, which he didn't a lot, and that's one of the issues with split finger fastballs in general. And he throws his with a little kind of a funky grip, is they can be a very temperamental pitch. And if you miss with a splitter, it's basically a batting practice fastball. Like if it doesn't drop, it's right down the middle, and it's not great because you're trying to entice these guys to swing at a pitch that looks like it's coming down the middle and then isn't. But that was, he was able to get by with a cutter and, moving his fastball around. And I thought I was encouraged by that. I don't know if he's ever going to have that fully reliable dominant splitter that we kind of hoped, but he's also got a knuckle curve, and he's a guy who very much will continue to work at his craft too. He's a guy like, I don't know. I was able to interview him 2-3 years ago at a Christmas thing there at Comerica Park, and you could tell immediately just by talking to him the maturity and the understanding of the game and the want to get better. It was a number 1 overall pick personality, and I think we saw that a little bit last year, and I think he will continue to find ways to compete and succeed, but he probably won't be that number 1, number 2 starter without that plus splitter that he supposedly had, and I don't know if it's going to come back.
Well, Rogelio and Chris, we really appreciate you guys walking us through what's been happening and where the Tigers stand. We appreciate you joining us and leading us through that. We'll be listening to you on Tigers Radio Pod, following your stuff on Motor City Bengals. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Really enjoyed talking about the Hall of Fame and the Tigers off season. As I mentioned, SABR Day in February. We plan to talk more about the Hall of Fame. We also plan to feature Jay Jaffe's Cooperstown Casebook as our next book for our book club. And so we'll have lots of good Hall of Fame discussions around that. It's literally true that Jay Jaffe wrote the book on Hall of Fame candidacies, and it's a good one and it's worth delving into. So stay tuned for more news. And Cooperstown Casebook, Haley has it there. And there's another book, Page Fence Giants, which we featured before. And again, work like that is part of telling the story of these pioneers, even as they get new recognition from the Hall of Fame, as Bud Fowler did this year. So stay tuned. It'll be quiet during the holidays, and then we will rev back up early next year, and we will see you then. Thanks, everyone.